Welcome to Module 9. Um, I guess welcome back. I know we've been on an extended break. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope you guys are healthy, you're practicing your social distancing, and yeah, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope this video finds you guys doing well. This is Module 9. We kind of skipped Module 8. Module 8 was covering Hispanic and Latino learners. And so we're going to cover that material through an article. The article is attached. Please read it. Okay. So we're skipping to Module 9, and Module 9 covers culturally responsive pedagogy. So by the end of this module presentation, you should know why our students need culturally responsive instruction. You should be able to compare mainstream values to diverse values. Understand some of the benefits of culturally responsive teaching. We're going to talk about 6 steps. I struggle with the word steps because it's not in order. 6 things you can do to develop a more culturally responsive pedagogy. And then we are going to also discuss very briefly what to do when someone is in denial of their home culture and they refuse to recognize their home culture, and then things that teachers can do in the classroom. And we're also going to learn about teacher reflection and things that teachers can address within themselves to become a more culturally responsive teacher. Sorry, my allergies are kind of cutting up, so if I cough, you guys forgive me and bear with me. Okay. So we know that classrooms are filled with students from many different culture backgrounds, different ethnic groups, and different races. It's what we do with that, what we do with those differences, how we use those differences to enrich our students' lives and their educational needs that turns just good teaching classrooms into a culturally responsive classroom. Okay. And so that's what I would like for you to consider today. How do we move past just good teaching? And I think that was the theme of chapter 7 in the textbook. Isn't it just good teaching? But it's obvious we need to move past just good teaching, because if it was just good teaching, those achievement gaps wouldn't still exist, but they do. So we need to move past just good teaching. So this is the definition of culturally responsive teaching, and um, it's the definition from Geneva Gay. We're going to watch one of her videos. It's attached on Blackboard, but she is a researcher in this field. And so there's a lot of research that she's done in this field. So this is her definition. Culturally responsive teaching is using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of references, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more appropriate and effective for them. It teaches to and through the strengths of these students. Okay, so think about that. That's what culturally responsive teaching is. And it uses all of those experiences that students come with and their culture background to make their learning more appropriate and then more effective. Okay, so if you look at the picture, that big gap in the middle between the two black rocks, that's the achievement gap. And if you follow any type of educational news, you know that there's huge achievement gaps in education. There's achievement gaps between white students and non-white students. There's achievement gaps between male and female students. And there's also achievement gaps between English language learners and non-English language learners. Okay, so the question is, what can we do? And you see the man, he's looking over the rock and he's saying, they say this thing is going to close. And then the man behind him says, did they say when? So That's our goal as educators, to close those achievement gaps where students are growing at the same rate together. There's not these huge disparities between what some students know compared to what other students know, how some students grow compared to how other students grow. That our students are achieving the same. So, here are some things that we can do to close this achievement gap. And these were suggested through research. We could have more rigorous research-based curriculum, the use of ELL strategies in the classroom. One of the court cases that we learned about, one of the historical court cases, said that just providing the same materials isn't providing an education for English language learners. They need strategies that are specifically used to help and enrich English language learners. Explicit language teaching, having certified educators that have gone through the schooling and have the education to teach these types of learners. And then lastly is culturally responsive pedagogy. Okay, so this achievement gap exists, and we have to think of all the different things, all the different possibilities that could be attributing to this achievement gap. And addressing culturally responsive instruction is one of those things that we can address to hopefully close the achievement gap. So this is a video by Dr. Geneva Gay. It is attached on Blackboard, and you will watch it on your own. This is She's the person that we read the quote from. Okay, so after you watch the video, I just want you to consider some of the topics that Dr. Gay talked about in her video. And she talks about the reasons to consider cultural differences, and there's lots of different reasons. So there's academic reasons, there's psychological reasons, there's social or political reasons, and historical reasons to consider the differences between cultures. And most of the time in classrooms, these things are filtered through the dominant culture of society. And we know in education, the dominant group that teach in education are white females. And so all of these different things are filtered through their cultural norm, but that doesn't reflect the students who are in their classroom. So we have to challenge teachers to consider the cultures and the differences of other students and those differences in cultures that the students bring into the classroom. Okay, so we get to this chart. This was out of chapter 7 in the textbook. Um, what do you do in a classroom full of different cultures and ethnicities? Do you just cater to one? Do you just cater to the other? Is catering or bringing in one culture, is that taking away from another culture? We're going to consider what that does. So there is, excuse me, mainstream, or you might hear the term dominant values. And then we're going to compare those to diverse or non dominant values. So, just to sum up, dominant values, um, we end up with the values being individualism and freedom. Okay. And as you can see under the list, those things align with that. And for non dominant values, uh, they value working with others and cooperation. So when you have students in your classroom in both of these groups, you have to cater to the values of both cultures. And teachers have to be intentional about that because there's positive features in both cultures, but we have to fuse those together. And it's important for students and children to experience both kinds of values. Okay, but that doesn't happen in a lot of classrooms. Typically, classrooms just reflect mainstream or dominant values. And so those students who are part of the non-dominant culture and groups oftentimes are not connecting, and their educational experience isn't as effective and as appropriate because their values and the lenses that they see the world through are never considered in the classroom. And so that is the challenge, to get outside of just seeing education and seeing the world through dominant culture, the lens of dominant culture, seeing the world through a different lens. Okay, so some of the benefits of culturally responsive instruction. What are some of those benefits? The first one is that, and I think this is important, that this doesn't just benefit the children that are a part of the culture. Culturally responsive instruction benefits all students. Okay, and then it also brings in the asset perspective that it helps us to see the students' diversity as an asset. Okay. And it ignites pride for that student. And it also grows the teacher as a person. So if you know, or if you're just comfortable with being around people that are the same culture as you, um, it gives you a chance to expand your horizon and to grow as a person, to not stay the same, to get to know other cultures, to experience different cultures. And a lot of people say, well, I love to travel. Um, Not just experiencing cultures that you're comfortable with, but experiencing different parts of cultures, even cultures that are uncomfortable, or even parts of the culture that you can't control and you don't have control over. You just have to experience it. Okay. And the last one is that all students grow. And I think I touched on that before. Bringing in different cultures and different experiences of different students is an asset to all students. All students are enriched. All students start to grow. So we're going to kind of go through a list of things that you can do to develop a more culturally responsive pedagogy in the classroom. First, know your student. Who are the students in your classroom that are culturally and linguistically diverse? Okay, so I put down some good resources would be the home language survey, which we talked about that a few weeks ago. That is the survey that is mandatory in schools. Parents have to fill it out when they enroll their children. Also, another resource might be the ELL team, but I think the biggest resource is the student. Develop a relationship with them and get to know them. You're going to read in the teaching, no, not the teaching tolerance article. You're going to read in the Hispanic Latino learners article about a lady who said when her siblings were growing up, like in the 70s and 80s, that they didn't feel connected to their teacher and they felt like their teacher ignored them. That had a negative effect on their educational and academic experience. So it's important that we develop relationships with all students. And it's really easy to develop relationships with students that are culturally the same as us. But we have to get out of our comfort zone to develop relationships with students that are culturally diverse and culturally different from ourselves. So the second thing that we can do is a needs assessment. And I feel like this comes up every module. We need to know what language is the child speaking at home? What is their previous experience? And this ties in with the first one, with that home language survey. What ethnic group is the student? It's important, not where they're from, what ethnic group do they identify with? Okay. I keep wanting to say step. The next thing that we can do is build home and school ties. Okay. One of the things that might be a big asset for you would be a translator that could help you communicate with the parent and with the families. It might not be a parent, it might be a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle. So we need to connect and bridge home and school. There is so much research that supports when there is a strong home school relationship, student achievement is higher. Okay. And so we want to have that strong home school relationship. And sometimes it's hard, especially when there is a language barrier. And so we have to do all that we can to work past that language barrier. We can't just say, oh, I can't communicate with them. So, I just won't do it. Or we'll just send a no home in English, knowing that the families can't read English. That's not our job. That's not doing your job as a teacher. We need to get out of our comfort zone, find a way to communicate with them, even if it's typing something in Google and having it translated to their home language. We have to attempt to build that bridge between school and home. Okay. Whenever you are communicating with the parents, try not, if it's the last possible option, try not to have a child work as a translator. That kind of undermines the parent, um, and it's not positive for the child. They become, just a tool. And I can see how some people might think that's positive, but it has a lot of negative effects on the child and mostly on the parents also. Um, Always welcome the parents to participate in their child's education. And sometimes we even have to teach parents our expectations. We have to teach parents how we expect them to participate in their child's education because some parents don't know, and we have to do all that we can to help them. And then the last one is my favorite, and some people have to grow to be comfortable with this, but home visit, home visit, home visit. Just a minute while I plug on my computer. Sorry. Okay, so there is, I don't know of a better way to get to know families and students than to actually take the time and visit their home. And you may be uncomfortable the first time you do one, but for me personally, I have grown to love it. Even if you just spend an hour with that family after school or an hour with them on the weekend, you learn so much more about them by going into their home and spending that time with them. And that strengthens the relationship between home and school. Okay, next, identifying the student's English proficiency level. And this is done through an access assessment. And this is when you know what the student's proficiency level is, you're able to give them developmentally appropriate challenges and assignments. Okay. And when the work that they're doing is developmentally appropriate, then they are growing. Okay. So if a student was at an expanding level, level 4, you wouldn't want to be asking them yes and no questions. They're not growing. They're not growing. You would be wanting to work on those bridging skills with them. So it's really important that you are aware of their English proficiency level. Okay? The next step, you are going to want to plan to meet students' needs. And this ties into the chapter that we read for this module, which is chapter 7. And the entire theme of it was it's not just good teaching. We have to be intentional about planning to include our students' cultures in our classrooms. And we also have to teach the whole student. So you might have heard the term Maslow before Bloom's. We have to meet all of their physiological needs before we can meet their academic needs. So we have to consider their social and emotional needs that they have also. So we need to be intentional about working with our students. And lastly, we want to monitor the students, monitor how they're doing socially and emotionally. And we want to monitor their progress in academics, their progress with language, and how they are growing. If students are not growing, we can't continue to do the same things. We have to change. And that goes back to intentionality. We have to be aware of where our students are and if they're growing, if they're not growing, so that we can give them the most effective and appropriate education that they can get. Okay, so what are some things that you can do in the classroom? These are just a few things. However, there's so many different ideas. And honestly, you might have a great team who has lots of different resources. You might find great resources online. Um, Color in Colorado has many resources. You might find some books that you can check out to learn more about creating a more culturally responsive pedagogy. There are lots of research, lots of articles, tons of pins on Pinterest. There's so many ideas. You just have to start. You just have to start. You can't talk about it. You just have to start. Okay. So the first one was incorporating the students' cultures in examples that we provide. And this also ties into literature. The literature in your classroom should reflect the students that are in your classroom. And even if you don't have a culturally diverse classroom, you should still have culturally diverse literature. You are going to decorate your classroom uh, with pictures and graphics that reflect the students and their home culture. And it reflects the students that are in your classroom. Remember, representation matters. Students should see pictures of other students and adults that look like them. Okay? You could even learn a few words in the student's language. You may learn a greeting in the student's language. Um, that means so much to students. And when you see their eyes light up, you know that it was worth the 5 minutes that took to look up that greeting and to practice it and remember it. Fourth one, this is my pet peeve. Learn to pronounce the student's name. You just have to. And it may be difficult, it may take a lot of practice. You may have to write it down phonetically, but whatever you do, learn to pronounce the student's name. And that starts at such an early age. As a kindergarten teacher, sometimes I don't find out that I'm pronouncing the student's name until their parents come in or an older sibling comes in and says, "Oh, that's not how you say it." Make sure that you're pronouncing the student's name correctly. Imagine um, existing day in and day out, and everybody is pronouncing your name wrong. That doesn't celebrate you as a person. So make sure that's the only thing you do on this list. Make sure you learn how to pronounce your students' names and don't try to give them a nickname. That's easier for you. Pronounce their names correctly. Okay. Uh, the next point, when it's appropriate, it's okay to discuss the differences in religions and the differences in culture. I think that is enriching when students actually want to talk about their religion and their culture compared to someone else's. We just have to make sure we do it in an appropriate and respectful way. You can use students' names on assessments that you can create. And remember to always be non judgmental and show respect and appreciation for your students' culture. Okay. And don't be afraid to ask when learning from students and parents. Okay, and a lot of people, I think a lot of questions that people have, is it okay to say black or is it okay to say African American? Ask somebody that you trust. Ask somebody that you are close to. It's okay to ask. If you don't ask, you won't ever know and you'll always feel uncomfortable. I think you need to be careful with younger students versus older students because they may go home, and say, my teacher asked me this, and they won't explain the context. And so you may have to explain it to parents at a later time if they have concerns about it. But with older students, ask. And a lot of students are happy to discuss and to talk about their culture and what makes them different, what makes them unique. So be open to learning and growing by asking the students. And the last point was don't overgeneralize. And this is something that a mistake that I made um, as a new teacher. Um, I knew that I had students who were Muslim and they could not consume gelatin because it is a pork byproduct. And so whenever I would have snacks or somebody brought something in, I would give them an alternative snack um, if we were eating something that had gelatin in it, or like if we had a class party and somebody brought fruit snacks, I wouldn't serve them the fruit snacks, I would give them something different. So in this example, I kind of under generalized, but I had another student who was from, I think it was from Burma, some part of Asia, and he was Muslim also and I had given him some fruit snacks a few times, but I didn't know, and I didn't know because I didn't ask. I just assumed that he wasn't Muslim. He he didn't fit in with the Somali students. He didn't talk about Duxie, which is a school that they go to. And so I just assumed that he wasn't. And I was giving him things that he shouldn't have had. So that speaks to why it's so important to know your students and build relationships with them so that you get to know who they are. Okay, so I said we're going to talk about home cultural denial. Sometimes there may be some students who resist being their cultural background and they don't want to be associated with it. And when you have a student like this, I, it's important to remember that you need to proceed with caution, but proceed. Don't just say, okay, and never revisit it. There is probably a reason why they are denying their home culture and teachers need to be cautious and be aware of that. That goes back to having relationship. When you have relationships with students, you are aware of how they feel. And so remember, never force them to be a cultural representative, but always encourage them to feel proud of their culture and never give up on doing that. Even if they resist it every time, never give up on including their culture and including them in the classroom. Okay, so this is another video that you're going to watch. It is attached on Blackboard, and she has 5 essential steps to um, move forward with cultural responsiveness. Okay. And a lot of these steps, well, all of these steps to me are focused on self reflection. And I think self reflection is such a huge part of having a more culturally responsive classroom. So the first step is self awareness, knowing what cultural group you identify with and what are the values of your culture group. Number two is the cultural awareness of other groups. So you have to consider what biases and prejudices do you have. And we all have them. Some of them are taught to us very young, but we have to be aware of them. What hidden biases do you have? Okay. And how do you interpret the values and beliefs of other culture groups? These are things that you have to consider. Next one, your cultural knowledge. Are you aware of different cultures and their communication and conflict styles? Um, I think as you grow as an educator and as you have more students, you become aware of different cultures, but you can't refuse to not be aware. You can't say things like, I don't see color, I don't see different cultures, I just see people. Everybody comes with their own set of cultural experiences and cultural norms, and you have to consider those differences as an educator. Next, are you aware of how different cultures show up in the classroom? How different cultures participate in the classroom. One example that she talked about was back channeling. And this is something that is typically seen in the African American culture, where someone is talking and then the person who they're talking to, the listener or the receiver, gives them some type of feedback, some type of output to let them know that they're listening and they're following along. And a lot of teachers see this as rude, but it's just a cultural communication practice in the African American culture. And a lot of students are penalized and punished for doing this and participating in class this way. The teacher is not knowledgeable of this cultural norm. The next one, cultural skills. Do you have skills to work with different cultures? If you are a person who just refuses to acknowledge different cultures, you probably don't want to be an educator because it will be very uncomfortable for you. You are going to be around people of different cultures, different ethnic groups, and so you have to develop those skills to work with different cultures and to accept different cultures and to be open to learning about different cultures. Okay. And the last step was action forward. And this is the big reflection part. Do you actively change your perspective and behavior to adapt to others? So, do you just deny that, well, that's their culture, this is mine, and I'm going to do things my way? Do you apply a cultural lens, or do you expect others to conform to your culture? And think about, as an educator, if you expect all the students to conform and adjust to your culture just so you're comfortable, or do you try to put on their cultural lens and make things appropriate and ultimately effective for their learning and their achievement? Okay, so this is the presentation I have for you guys today. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me, and have a great week and stay safe.